Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. We're so pleased to be here this morning to be part of the Digital Science Global Showcase 2020. My name is Darrell, Gunter, and I'm going to be your host and moderator today for this illustrious panel and most important topic about transparent research. During our time today, we will address these 4 questions. How can we make transparent research more easier? What are the implications for transparent research? How does trust factor into transparency? What are the important steps to automate checks for transparency? We are joined with a phenomenal panel. Mark Leggott, who is from the Research Data Canada, Leslie McIntosh from Ripeta, and Sonya Towers from Wellcome Trust. Welcome, panel. I'm so happy that you're all here to talk about this very important topic. Okay, so we have 5 sections, and to our audience, please be sure to log your questions. We will take questions at the end. But let's kick off this session with Sonya. Sonya, to get things started, I'd like you to give us a brief statement about your thoughts about transparency in research.
Okay, so at Wellcome, we think transparency in research is extremely important. So we work to ensure that the research we fund is open and accessible so it can have the greatest possible impact. So making research transparent ensures that researchers can verify results, build on research, and use it to advance knowledge and ultimately lead to health improvements. So to demonstrate our commitment to transparency and openness, we have a data, software, and materials management policy, which we expect our grant holders to abide by. So in this, we state we expect grant holders to make supporting data available at the time of publication, as well as any software required to view the data sets or repeat the analysis. We also ask applicants to submit an outputs management plan as part of their initial application. So this is really important because it encourages applicants to think about how they share their research outputs before they even start their studies.
Excellent, excellent. Leslie, let's hear your viewpoint.
Yeah, I will echo what Wellcome does. I mean, it's certainly very important. And to build on that, I'm going to come from when I used to be a researcher hat, because I think we have to balance the fact that transparent research is extremely important, which means showing what you're doing. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that research is complex, researchers are busy, and researchers aren't necessarily ordered in the way that they think about processes. I mean, there is order and there's not. So I think we really have to think about the different players in the ecosystem and never forget about the researcher themselves and how important it is to make that transparent research easier for them and to facilitate that work rather than simply saying that they need to do it, but also give them methods to do that. So there's my view.
Mark, let's hear your viewpoint, please.
Well, I would certainly highlight both Sonya and Leslie's comments. I come from different perspectives. One is a funder of research in the context typically of funding the development of research data management platforms. And I also come at it from a national organizational perspective where we facilitate the adoption of best practices in terms of data management. But so in those 2 contexts, I think Leslie's comment about making it easier for researchers to ensure transparency in their research and Sonya's comment about, making your research outputs accessible as soon in the research lifecycle as possible. Those are 2 things that I would definitely highlight. And I would also highlight the role of funders, infrastructure providers, software developers in making that researcher, making their job of doing research or their joy of doing research easier. And I would put the onus on funders and infrastructure providers in making sure that there's a sustainable infrastructure underneath the ecosystem so that researchers don't have to think about all of the things involved in making their research more transparent. So just a few
in essence, it's providing the researcher with more information and more guidelines and more tools that will assist them. So when we think about the implications for transparent research, Leslie, what are these implications for transparent research? Implications, consequences of having it or not having it?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take the bigger picture view right here, and I'll use COVID as an example of where we're at on this. We've seen a movement towards making science more open and available. And I think if we use COVID as an example, you see both the good of that and the bad of that. So one of the things, there's been a very extreme push to have data availability statements, which the idea was to have the research data be more available. And what we've noticed as an example in COVID is that becomes very important when you're trying to solve a global pandemic problem very quickly. It's not easy to then try to get a hold of somebody to try to get the data. So the data being there and those people that have made the data not only available, but also accessible has been incredible. And some of them did that before the pandemic ever started. That was the practice. It hasn't been all of the articles or all of the research, excuse me, but there was a lot. So that's the good part. I think the challenging part of transparent research is there is a disconnect between what goes on in science and what people who aren't scientists understand about science. And so there has been an opportunity to take advantage of the fact that science is a very consensus building ecosystem, and we look at different things, and yet in aggregate, I should say, rarely is it one paper that makes or breaks something, at least not initially. You may see that in hindsight, but you don't see that moving forward. But that is not, when we make things transparent, it could then also be seen as problematic if it's taken the wrong way. And I'll give an example. There was one preprint that went out about ABO blood type with COVID, and I looked at it, and it was, I felt for the researchers because it was a pretty good research article. I think it deserved to be published, but it got a lot of hype. And so then there was a disconnect between really what the research meant and the strength of the research in the global perspective and how it was getting presented. So those are my two aspects, or two things about transparency.
And Mark, from your point of view, transparency in research is very important. But what have you seen across the course of your career? Has research become more transparent, or has it become less transparent, or there's some issues along with making it very transparent? Because the general public really sometimes misinterprets. They're not scientists, they're not researchers, and they see a blurb and they run with that. What are your thoughts there about the implications of research, transparent research?
It's a great question, Darrell. And for me, the fundamental, the great strength of science and research is that it's always questioning itself. So science and scientists are always questioning their science and their research. And the big disadvantage of science is they're always questioning their research, and they're always, having arguments and discussing the way the research comes out. And in the public context, that, as you suggest, can be misconstrued as the science being false or fallible, or rather than highlighting that's the great strength of the way science has been done for many years. So for me, the impact of transparency is it does help to increase the credibility of research. But I think it is very much a philosophical policy process. There are so many aspects to research transparency to ultimately lead to an increase in the public credibility of research. And I think the onus is on all of us, not just the researchers, to ensure that the public and other researchers in other disciplines or in the same discipline understand that, that constant questioning is a strength, and it is the way research works. And so we shouldn't misconstrue that questioning as weakness in the process. So that certainly, I think, would be my primary observation in terms of the impact of transparency, is that while it seems that opening the the doors and providing all the details in terms of the raw data and your software algorithms and all those things to a researcher, sometimes that can seem like, jumping over the precipice and showing the weakness of your arguments or your data, but at the end of the day, it's the only way. It's the only way to do it.
And Sonya, from Wellcome's trust position, because you're a major funder, and I don't know if people say thank you to Wellcome Trust enough for all that the great foundation does. What do you see as the implications of transparent research?
Yeah, so at Wellcome, we want all the research we fund to be open and transparent so that all the results are trusted and have the greatest possible impact. And it also gives us the best possible return on our investment. So in order to make research open and transparent, we're aware of the costs involved as well, because these are sometimes significant and sometimes other people don't think about them. So to promote openness and transparency, we allow applicants to request costs such as time for data managers and anonymization costs as part of their application. So we really do acknowledge that it really does take time to make research transparent, but we hope that the value of making the research transparent, such as increasing the credibility of the researchers, like has been said before, make this one worthwhile. So in order to demonstrate that we value openness and transparency, we take applicants' research outputs, including data, software, and code that they produce, into account when assessing their track records. I do think that sometimes it's hard to make research transparent. So researchers with sensitive data might have particular concerns, such as if the reuse is in line with the consent that they've obtained, or if the data could be used in a way that would put participants or communities at risk. But most often researchers are actually worried that others will misinterpret or otherwise inappropriately use their data to generate flawed conclusions, which can then have potential repercussions for them. So we hope that overall it's positive, but we do understand there are some barriers.
And so when we look at the critical path of the researcher, what can the industry do to educate and help the authors to be more productive in their preparation, so that when it comes to the peer review process, that the peer reviewers are really looking at whether this is good science or not? Leslie, what are your thoughts there about what can the industry do to better prepare our young researchers, or help existing researchers with new, better habits?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think what Sonya was talking about and what they're doing at Wellcome is fantastic, because they're actually putting money to help support good data practices, good research practices, because to be a researcher, people are experts in their field. And so if we ask them to do too much, then you're really asking them to go beyond their field. But if you give them some funds to support things like research data management, and Mark, I know you're on the both funding and supporting side of this, that really helps make this work better, and it's much needed for that, to support that. And I'm just going to do a shout out to the libraries too, because they provide a lot of support these days. I mean, I know there's plenty of us who think, oh, it's a book, we're going to go check out a book. That is not what research libraries do anymore. It's amazing to go and get that help, and it's needed. And if I can just chime in and reflect on one thing that both Sonya and Mark said, as somebody who's had to share data, it's also just emotionally scary. I mean, and I've seen that with other researchers, because you're afraid of somebody come back. There's two things, yes, they could misuse your data, but you could get criticized. And for those of us who love data, we take that very seriously. And so there's that vulnerability. And I think that's part of the ecosystem of support that we also have to add, that it is a little scary to share your data if you can. There's all the caveats. But because we live in a world that also can be very critical, it's been really nice to see people who have shared the data, who've corrected mistakes. And it's really nice to see the support of places like Research Data Canada and Wellcome also support the fact that we understand that working with data is a little messy too. So,
And Mark, from your perspective, what do you think the industry can do to help the researchers to be better prepared, submit better papers?
Sure. I mean, as a former university librarian, I would support Leslie's comments about the library community. It's a great community and people that are available to support researchers. I would also highlight the role of companies like Leslie's and others in building robust infrastructure that does truly make it easier for researchers to share their data. But importantly, I think trusting that those companies are able to build the infrastructure in such a way that it does not only make the researcher's job easier, but that the researchers can trust that this software is actually doing things the right way and doing the things that they need it to do, whether it's anonymizing data or analyzing the technical aspects of a paper or the nature of the data. So I think we have the technology available to us to make researchers' jobs easier and to support the kinds of things that a Wellcome Trust would require researchers to do in return for those grant funds. So I think it's incumbent upon funders like myself and colleagues to support the industry in building those tools, not just in building the tools and doing them in a robust way, but also in a sustainable way. So there isn't this constant 3 years of applying for new funds to maintain a piece of software that has suddenly become irreplaceable in a researcher's toolkit. So a few comments there on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Sonya, from Wellcome's position as a major funder and all for transparent research, what are some of the programs that Wellcome has in place that will assist new researchers to produce better research?
Yeah, so at Wellcome, we try and make openness and transparency easy by asking applicants to describe how they will manage their research outputs in their application to us in an outputs management plan. So we provide clear guidance on our website outlining what should be included in the plan, and also we provide lots of links to resources which provide guidance about how to share data, software, code, and materials. So these outputs management plans are actually reviewed by Wellcome staff, peer reviewers, and committee members. And we provide feedback and advice where required. And we're also just about to launch a new initiative. So it's a pilot called the Outputs Management Plan Support Service. Mm-hmm. So going forward, we're going to be asking Wellcome staff, peer reviewers, and committee members to flag when applicants have not provided a sufficient plan. So all the applicants host institutions, so we've had good engagement from libraries, from the host institutions of our organisations, and we'll work with the applicant to improve the outputs management plan at the beginning of the grant. So we think having a good outputs management plan in place is very important, as it means that researchers know exactly where they're going to manage their outputs from the beginning of the grant, and they know that the standards that are required. So this is much better than researchers, for say, rushing to store their data at the end of the grant and potentially running out of time, as we know sometimes happens. And we hope that this will make sharing a standard practice rather than an afterthought. Another thing is that Wellcome is a signatory to DORA, which is the San Francisco Agreement on Research Assessment. So by signing up to DORA, we agree when assessing an applicant's track record that the scientific content of the paper is more important than the identity of the journal in which it's published. Mm-hmm. But we also commit to recognising the value of all relevant research outputs. So this also includes data sets and software when we look at the applicant's track record. And additionally, we expect our grant holders institutions to also sign up to DORA or an equivalent statement, and for them to use these standards when assessing researchers' track records in hiring or promotions. And so we hope this should act to provide more of an incentive for researchers to make their work open and transparent.
Wow, that is awesome. During our last round of questions, I heard the word trust. And so our next question focuses on how does trust factor into transparency? Leslie, trust is very important, and I believe when people are sharing data, it might be a big concern. But let's talk about trust.
Yeah, and maybe we could break down trust a little bit, right? Because there's already what we talked about, sort of trust in science at a much larger level, and I'm going to just I think that we'd have to take offline, or maybe we can discuss at the networking session that's a little bit later. But how do you trust what the paper is? And this is the example I always like to give, is the first thing you want to do is just I think check for some quality measures, right? And at very high levels. So the way I like to think about it is with my teenage stepson, first, are your clothes clean? That's all we're caring about right now. And in the scientific context, that is, do you have the pieces there that you should have there? Do you have a study objective or a hypothesis? Do you have a data availability statement, your funding statement, your ethics statement? So that's a really high level, but it's a very important level, and it's a level of trust that you start with. And then you want to go to, well, are your clothes actually ironed, or, not wrinkled? They don't have to be ironed, but are they not wrinkled, type of thing? And that's where you definitely start looking at the trust of the different sections. So the trust of the statistical methodology, the trust of the analyses type, the trust of the cell lines, if you're in that area, or the trust of the survey that you developed, that type of thing. So you get much more granular, and you can see where I'm going with that. So I think from a scientific standpoint, if we start where scientific gold is, which is in our publications, then that's how we need to look at trust. And then I think we can think about building that trust outward after that.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, trust is such a huge word. And in your counsel with your colleagues, how do you talk about trust? It factors into transparency.
Well, there's, as Leslie suggested, there's so many levels and so many aspects to the nature of trust and transparency. I think listening to Leslie brought to mind the different stages in the life cycle and analysis, for example. So when researchers are analyzing data, they're using tools like R or similar tools depending on their context to analyze the data. And I think when it comes to the kinds of tools that researchers would use to affect transparency and respond to funder mandates for sharing data and creating DMPs and doing all those kinds of things, I think we're kind of in not the infancy, but we're in the early stages of those tools that facilitate those aspects of open science and data sharing. So I think, in the same way that researchers generally trust that the analysis tools that they're using are doing that analysis properly, and there's not some kind of flaw in the inner workings of the software or the equipment, I think we need to get ourselves to the same level of trust with the tools that are facilitating open science, and whether it's the actual data sharing platforms or, again, tools that are used to analyze the data and do anonymization and all of those kinds of things. So I think finding a way to increase the trust in those tools, I think, is a critical path. And again, it comes back to our goal as infrastructure providers should be to make the job of researchers easier so that they can focus the bulk of their time on doing the research rather than prepping the data for sharing. So I think that is definitely a focus of my day. Mm-hmm. in the research Canada personality when I'm talking to colleagues, is how do we make that job easier? How do we facilitate the job of the researchers and not make data sharing or open science an onerous additional task that they're taking on?
Thank you. And Sonya, from Wellcome Trust's position of trust and transparency, what are some of the best practices that you see that folks can utilize to increase trust and transparency?
Yeah, so for Wellcome, we don't just focus on the initial outputs that are associated with publications as transparency. So we think of all outputs of research we fund. We want them all to be made openly available, which means that researchers can validate each other's work, but also mean there is less duplication of efforts and an overall increase in the speed of knowledge enhancement. So I think, yeah, so trust definitely leads to transparency, and researchers need to trust if their outputs are reused that they will be properly credited. Mm-hmm. And so that's something we've been trying to work on, is think about ways in which there can be that reuse of data and software can be easily credited. And we also, in our data sharing policy, we say that people must credit when they use other people's data sets, materials, and things like that. So yeah, we've often found researchers are concerned that they will spend a long time collecting data, and that somebody else would analyze the data and produce a paper and maybe not credit them. And so there really needs to be trust and a commitment in the community to ensure this doesn't happen. And this is something that we are actively thinking about at Wellcome and what we can do.
Well, we have a very interesting question from Ms. Milena. And she asks, well, how about transparent research in industry and companies? What are the feelings in regards to research that's coming out of pharmaceutical companies? What about the trust factor there? Mark, what are your thoughts?
Oh,
sorry, Leslie, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Leslie.
I just put it in there. I just wanted to make sure, because there's a movement with Open Pharma, and then anyone else chime in on that, but I wanted to highlight what they're doing to try to make the work in pharma more transparent.
Yeah, that's a good initiative, and it's an interesting question. I just had a conversation with a colleague in Canada who's doing research together with, she's in health sciences and her colleague is in chemistry, and they're doing research on a potential promising drug to have an effect in the COVID-19 context. And her big concern is, we want to bring this to market. We want to partner with an industry partner. We don't want to divulge, the details of what we're doing too soon, or we don't know if we can ever do it. And so, what that conversation brought front and center is that you can't have openness necessarily in all aspects of the full research life cycle and the bringing to market kind of part of the life cycle of this research. So I think it's important to consider openness in the right context. And I think it's also important for industry partners to consider the value of openness in having brought to them a promising drug, because it's very unlikely that promising chemical or drug or treatment would ever come to that industry partner without having had open research beforehand. So those partnerships with universities and colleges and other partners, nonprofits that share research openly in order to advance research is critical in leading up to the creation of a drug or something that then goes into the industry pipeline. So I think that we have to recognize that openness at different parts of the research and industry life cycle is important to understand that it can't necessarily be open the whole time. Having said that, I think it's also time to overcome hundreds of years of traditional approaches to whether it's patents or trademarks or IP, and think about how an open approach to these kinds of things can lead to even greater innovation and economic advance when practiced. So.
And Sonya, what is Wellcome Trust's position on industry and companies that are non-academic, but they're involved in the research process?
So we do sometimes, some of the things that we fund have collaboration from industries as well. And I think maybe they're not often so aware of open practices as we would want, but we often actually find quite good engagement. And I think the only barrier that we find is, rather than just making it open because that's what science says we should do and that is what the community is doing now, they need to know that there will be an outcome from it. So we've often found that they're happy to do it, but they need to know that it's being used and things like that. But I think that might be because quite often the industry data that we've been dealing with, which is quite often surveillance data, can take a long time to prepare to be used. And so they needed to know that their time was justified. But I've been pleasantly surprised. I've found they're relatively receptive to being open.
And Leslie, what are you seeing from your perspective at Ripeta in regards to, professional companies, pharma, et cetera, getting involved and being open and transparent?
So if it's publishers, then they're definitely part of the discussion. We're really early on when it comes to other people in the industry, although I have had conversations with one pharmaceutical company a year ago and moving the conversation forward. So that's exciting to see. Okay.
And so to build on that, Leslie, how can we make transparent research easier?
So I come from an informatics background, and of course I started a company called Ripeta, so there's my biases right there, but I think we have to automate what we can. And we have to build in trust and checks into those automation practices. So not only do we need to make science faster through be more open, be faster, but we have to embed checks into that process as well. There's a lot of parts of science that I think could be automated, and that's what we're trying to do. I don't think it's going to get rid of some of needing scientists to review and critically look and have discussions about things, but there are services. And again, I'm biased because I built a company called Ripeta so that we could automatically check, do these checks using natural language processing to do that so that people could get back to the science that they want to do. So,
and Mark, when you think about, from your perspective, with your extensive background, what are the key things that you see that you would like to see, tools that will make transparent research easier?
I'm actually going to take a step back and partly address one of the other questions that was asked about, addressing the fear of judgment or criticism as a barrier, and suggest that in addition to tools like the ones that Ripeta is creating, my part of my background that I didn't mention was creating a company out of a piece of open source software that was developed at one of the universities I worked at. And it was always amazing to me to see in the open source community, a developer hesitant to release their code and make their, quotes, messy code available to the broader community by open sourcing it. And the empowerment that was suddenly obvious when they eventually did, get the courage to release their code and make it available to the wider community. So I think the key is highlighting to people, whether it's through examples or helping them actually release the data, that it's a very empowering thing to do. And rather than facing judgment or criticism, I think almost every time people are going to face, wow, kudos, or your data's amazing, it's really helped me do this. So I don't think I ever saw an instance in my community, which was the open source one, where somebody was slammed for making their code openly accessible. It was exactly the opposite. So I think I'm not sure how to best, again, push a researcher into that zone where they cross the barrier and see the power that comes from making their data and code and samples, whatever it is, more accessible. But I think that's critical in addition to creating flawless tools and tools that can facilitate the researcher's work. I think it's encouraging that step into open science and data sharing, and to realize what an amazing and empowering process that is.
Mm-hmm. Sonya, from again, from Wellcome Trust's point of view, what are the top 1 or 2 things that you would like to see, or that Wellcome is advocating to make transparent research easier?
Yeah, so we ourselves are actually in the process of creating a software tool that can assess whether research outputs provided by our research people that we fund are fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So initially this will be available to us, but then we hope to extend it to the institutions that we fund, and so that they can carry out their own checks, and that they can then help their own researchers. I was going to touch upon something that Mark mentioned.
Yes, please.
Was that another part of my role at Wellcome is I'm on the Early Career Advisory Board, and we're currently running a data sharing campaign. And so we've been trying to put together lots of case studies to show examples of when data sharing has been really good for people, or all of the positive outcomes of data sharing, and to try and suppress the negative stereotype. So we hope that that will help as well, and just maybe get people to more focus on the positives rather than the negatives.
And I would suggest that that information about how folks can learn more about that program is on the Wellcome Trust site, correct?
Yes.
Excellent.
But yeah, there's lots of great resources on there, and lots of really interesting case studies about how people have shared lots of different types of data. So I definitely advise people to check it out.
You know, I love that we're talking about data, and Milena had a follow-up question, and Milena asked, what about negative data? What does the panel think about negative data? Leslie?
Well, sharing negative data, I think, is fine. Getting published about that negative data is a little bit harder. So I think there's 2 aspects. I know that different funders are supporting the publication of negative results. And I'm assuming negative data, you're talking about negative results, because I'm not going into the falsification of data, which is a whole different story. So yeah, I mean, and that's part of being transparent. And just kind of, since we're talking about trust and now we're talking about data, I just want to also add there was a question about, I think 2 questions in the box that talk about the predominant English language, how do we decrease bias, and also, how do we deal with these, the emotions of sharing data. And I'd have to say, as we move forward, then we really need to make this a comfortable environment, not only for the dominant individuals in this world, but for those who are non-native English speakers, and making it conducive to share your data, share your code, have mistakes in there, be human and not being criticized for who you are, whether it be gender, race, or whatnot, because the things that we experience outside of science, we experience inside of science too. And I think it's important, as we move this forward, we consider that, we make that a comfortable environment from everybody in the ecosystem, from all the stakeholders.
Right. And Sonya, the person who asked that question about negative data also said, also negative results as well. How does Wellcome view the whole issue around publishing negative data, negative results?
I mean, we are very pro people publishing negative data, negative results, because we want everything to be openly available, but specifically these results will mean that there's not duplication of efforts, and will still help to increase the speed of knowledge advancement. So it's still something we're very behind, and we also value those when people put those in their grant applications. So it's something that we very much value.
Excellent. And Mark, from your vantage point, what are your thoughts about negative data, negative results?
Well, I would pull it back to, I think it was one of the other questions regarding the role of publishers. And I think clearly there's a role for publishers in taking a leadership position in allowing and encouraging the publication of negative results and kind of overcoming our 400-ish year tradition of scientific publications and journals, and focusing on that, that kernel of innovation that somehow warrants publication in those high impact journals. And I think it's one of my favorite journals is the Journal of Irreproducible Results, which is of course a somewhat often amusing, funny look into science and way of kind of looking in on our own institution of research. And I think we should encourage the production of the journal of negative results in X domain and Y domain, and whether it's a separate journal or a separate section in a journal, I think publishers really need to take a leadership role in that, because it will prevent additional studies in going through a lengthy process of coming up with the same conclusions and same negative results. And so there are so many advantages to it, and I think publishers need to take the leadership role there.
My esteemed panel, believe it or not, we're down to the last 4 minutes of our session. So we have one final question, and I'd like for Sonya to kick us off. Sonya, when you think about what are the important steps to automate checks for transparency?
Yeah, so I think initially researchers need to know exactly how they're going to make their research outputs open and transparent. And so this is why we, particularly at the Wellcome Trust, really push for applicants to produce an outputs management plan. And then we can provide them feedback, and this means that they will be confident about how to share their data and other research outputs from the beginning of the grant. And I think one thing that I have learned from our discussions around the new tool that we're thinking about building is that it's also really important that all researchers make their publications open access, because it will be very hard to automate a tool that also takes into account publications that are behind a paywall.
And Mark, from your perspective, what are the important steps to automate checks for transparency?
I would probably highlight the machine actionability aspect of whether it's a data set, the metadata, the descriptions, the journal article itself. I think the more structure and kind of common language and templates that can be used to ensure machine actionability with these various outputs, I think that's a key to accomplishing that.
And Leslie, last but certainly not least, from your perspective, what are the automated checks that you could put in to provide transparency of research?
Oh, well, I think we can, like what I've spoken about, we can automate quite a bit. To echo what Mark just said, having things in a more structured way that is both machine and human readable would make it much easier to be able to detect things like the hypothesis. And I know I harp on that one, but that actually is a really hard thing to detect when you're trying to go through PDFs and use a machine, whereas it might be easier for a human. So those are the types of things that I think we could check. Also, I just want to make sure that we give that feedback back to early in the stage so that we can improve things and not just judge things, because that's not what we want to do. We actually want to make better science easier and easier for all.
Absolutely. Mark, can you leave our audience with some closing thoughts about transparency in research?
My closing thought would be take the plunge. And as a researcher, for all the researchers on the call, sharing data, as I said, it's empowering. It's not, I think it's not the frightening workload, all the negative things that come from it. I would say that would be my encouragement.
Sonya?
I would just like to point out that there are so many resources out there that would give you help and advice and guidance on how to actually share your data or your research methods. But yeah, also want to echo, the thanks for not research librarians and things. Like, they're there to help you, and they really will provide you with a lot of help. So definitely utilize the people that are available at your research organization.
And Leslie, bring us home.
Let's make better science easier and easier for all. Thanks so much, Darrell, for hosting this. Really appreciate it.
It's been an honor and a pleasure, and I've learned so much. I want to thank my esteemed panel for their time and their expertise and their knowledge. And on behalf of our Transparency Research panel, we want to thank you and have you have a very safe day. God bless you. Take care.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Darrell.